Okay. Hopefully this isn't that long of a topic, but it also might become, I don't know, a long discussion. But at least my part of it should be relatively straightforward. So the topic today is invariance versus equivariance. The second word isn't one we use super often. One person who's kind of popularized the term is Jeff Hinton with capsules. He talked about equivariance a lot. Equivariance versus invariance. Equivariance is where when the input's changing, the representation is also changing, but in kind of a controlled way. Whereas invariance is where when your input's changing, the output is staying the same.
I didn't know that. I mean, I knew they got equivariance.
Yeah. So I think the broad narrative I'm going to push here is I think equivariance is more relevant to thinking about what Cortex is doing than invariance. Invariance is the exception. Equivariance is the more common thing, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So
you just said so far.
Okay, cool. So the high level question here is I'm questioning object identity representations. Yes, they will be needed in certain places, but for the most part, my question where I'm obviously coming in with kind of my own opinion on it is for most cortical processing, are invariant representations of object identity necessary? It will be necessary if you need to like say the name of an object. It comes up, but I think it might be less central than we make it when we, for example, have an object identity representation in every cortical column. Now I think to just talk about this in terms of computational principles, in terms of just deducing how these systems probably work, how the cortex broadly, what it's doing. I'm going to talk about it in terms of kind of this conventional view of the visual hierarchy, just because it's easy to make the point there, and other people have made the point there. I can point to papers where they write really well about it. But I think the principles of this can carry over, even if this conventional view, I've even made it as ridiculous as possible by just making all this into a simple feed-forward network. Obviously not the case, but it's what I'm going to use to make the point. So a proof of concept that a lot of cortical processing doesn't really center around getting an invariant object representation is this paper from DiCarlo and Cox, 2007, Untangling Invariant Object Recognition. I do have the paper up on the screen. I'm just going to zoom in on one figure because I drew a bunch of 2D things, but it's better to have a mental image of their pretty charts where here they draw 3D, but it's really symbolizing these planes that they have in various shapes are manifolds that, let's just say manifolds that the neural population occupies as an object changes, as an object rotates or moves closer, or if certain properties of change, if the head becomes larger, the nose and the head becomes a little larger. The point is this is showing the various activations, the various population activations that can occur for a given object. And so I'm just really only pointing to this as like, when I'm showing these 2D things, the mental image, this is a better mental image, I just can't draw this. And then you also just have to keep in mind this is standing in for something that's even higher dimensional. So here I'm showing, like in this, they lay out this theory that what you want, one way to understand what the visual hierarchy is doing, visual V1, V2, V4, IT, is that they're performing something they call manifold flattening. So the input, like let's just take an object. The input, as I rotated and moved this marker around, in their model, what would happen is in V1, the population activity is going to kind of move along this line or move along one of those planes. But it's kind of hopping around. Here I'm showing, as you can see, I'm showing unit 1, unit 2. These are like the activations of 2 neurons. But it's really a schematic picture. It's standing in for a larger population. So as this is moving, what I'm really going to build up to is even the area of cortex that many people think of as encoding object identity and for a temporal cortex, even there, changes to the object are going to cause activation to move along this line or along this plane, along this high-dimensional we'll say manifold, this high-dimensional manifold. But the key thing that has happened is these different layers have flattened the manifold in a way that makes it where it is possible to linearly separate various objects.
Make the readout easy.
Yes,
where easier classification.
But any change to the object is going to cause this representation to change.
I'm jumping ahead. It's the idea that as you go through successive regions, you're increasing the area of as you showed here. There's this huge manifold, and maybe flattening it locally, and flattening it again further, flattening it again further. So the whole you flattened it a bit in V1, you flattened it's more local flattening.
Yes.
Right. So it's locally classifiable or something.
Yes.
And then you're just doing it more and more as you go.
Yeah.
Right, and that's why we can decode object identity from IT very well, but it's really hard to do that from like a raw multi-unit V1 readout.
So the general idea here is that like this is the important part. This is the hard step. Later,
what's the hard step?
Oh, the hard step is this untangling. It's this flattening. This is the
computation.
computation.
Putting it flat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Once you have this, when you need an object label, when the language centers of your brain want to come up with a word for a thing you're looking at, or if other reasons come up why you need an object label, then it helps that visual areas are projecting all over the place, like IT to your language centers. If the part of your cortex that's trying to come up with a word to speak needs to name something, it probably is receiving input from IT. And it just needs to, I'll just read this text. When you need to think the name of an object, your language regions basically just have to linear classify the axons, these axons that are projecting to, they just say like, okay, IT axons, I'm going to classify you. All right, that's a marker. This I think is a coherent way of thinking of where object identity comes in. Is this certain that when necessary, the brain can get labels. It can get, you would call it an invariant object representation. But it's not so much this picture of temporally stable invariant object representations. It's task driven. It's like when you need to name something. Okay, I'm going to classify it real quick, figure it out. Okay, the word I need to say is marker. There's not so much this picture of like every part of cortex is trying to get a more temporally stable representation. It's more like the whole thing, the whole set could just be this more of an equivariant architecture rather than an invariant one. And this.
Well, so a lot of the things I said, I would agree with what you just said, but then it seems like if you, the process you have here though is if you look at the inputs coming into the cortex, they're changing rapid, really, really rapid, constantly. And so the ability to label, even if it's equivariant, right? The ability to label anyone is a challenge because you have too many points to label. It's just too, yes, in theory, every single point could be labeled. They're all unique to that object, but they're not simplistic, but there's too many of them.
Right.
And so it's just impossible. So what you have to, it seems like you have to go to say, well, how do I make it so it's possible to label this? You have to reduce the number of you have these changing inputs that are all equivariant to the object. You have to reduce it to a smaller number of points that are equivariant to the object. You don't have to get to one, but you have to reduce it to a smaller number of points. Otherwise, you can't label it. It's like every one of these points in the green and the black line here are unique to the object.
Yeah. So if you treat it as having to connect to all of these patterns, yes, that's unfeasible, or that's just too much. If you can come up with a neural mechanism though for actually detecting whether actually detecting whether this is on a certain side of a line, certain side of a hyperplane. Like if you can, I mean, this is what.
But that to do that, it seems to me. I mean, I don't know if we want to focus on the temporal stability, but you have to have a many-to-one mapping. You have to be able to say, to get to that desired point there in the IT level, you have to have a many-to-one mapping. You can't have as many points, I believe, in the IT curve as you can in the V1 manifold, because you still have this. I mean, there's no magic formula that says, oh, you know, I have all these points. To get them onto that flatter manifold, I have to somehow collapse them. I guess I'm saying I don't believe that there's. It strikes me incorrect to say that the number of points on the green manifold in V1 is the same as the number of points on the green manifold in I2. And if they're not, if you accept that premise, then there has to be a multiple many-to-one mapping going on, which in essence is what an object classifier does, right? You have an object classifier that takes many-to-one mapping. You can call it a plane through the two curves there, but it's still many-to-one mapping.
I'll use a blue marker because we have a blue marker apparently. Maybe a way to think about it that maybe you'll agree with is like it's almost like this set of codes is being mapped onto maybe this smaller set of codes.
Yeah, but that's the key. Is it a smaller set of codes or is it?
Well, yes, but
that's important. I'm trying to make, right?
It's so if you have okay, from the perspective of like math, this whole thing has been just compressed into a smaller space, but there's still a continuous chain.
Fine, there's continuous, but let's be discrete about it.
But
right?
yes, if you have if you have
discrete points,
yes,
right?
If you have a discrete number of codes, which in the end you will, yes, you're right. The number of those codes.
So that's the argument. That's the argument for the requirement of some level of temporal pooling. Temporal pooling is just a way of saying I have multiple input points that map into fewer output points. And whether that's a hard requirement or not is the key issue here. I agree it is. I think you just sort of accepted that argument. But if you do, then that to me is what it means to create that invariance. It's all you're trying to do is do a many to fewer mapping.
Okay.
Many-to-one mapping would be ideal, but you can't usually get all of that. You can only do that to a certain extent. But even a many-to-few requires at any point in time, there'll be some number of points that map to a single point, and another number of points that map to a single point. So there's still a, and that's to me the essence of invariance is not that you have to have a single point, but you have to do this many-to-one mapping or many-to-fewer mapping or more to fewer or something like that. Another interesting, if I can just jump in, I don't know if I did you cover most of what you want to cover here or no?
No, I mean, you can jump in. I'm planning on just talking through these bullet points quickly, but that'll provoke more discussion. So if you have something.
So if I think about our models, we have an interesting thing here. You know, we show these manifolds as continuous, right? But if I think about the way the temporal memory represents sequences, or even the way we represent objects in the cortical column, those points, which you consider like locations, you know, the location representations in the sequence, they're not on any manifold. They're just a bunch of almost like random. They're almost like random assignments in some sense. That together, each one of them is unique to the object, but they're not on a continuous manifold. If I look at the elements in a sequence memory, I can't look at two elements and say, oh, these are next to each other in any kind of way. It's just sort of like these points that are random. And so even there's this interesting problem, because if there's truth to that, the way we model this, and I would argue the same thing's going on in the object recognition module, then you don't have this manifold. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to take a bunch of points, in some sense, turn it into a local manifold. Again, that's what the temporal pooler is doing. It's trying to say, okay, now I have this more smoother thing, which doesn't change as often like that. And these multiple points here map onto some sort of smoother element there. So I think this idea that, you know, that's part of our theory. It's not how people think about it. People think about these manifolds as being more sort of continuous. But I used to think that too, but I don't think anymore. And I think that the raw manifold, if you want to call it a manifold in a column, it's not continuous at all. It's a bunch of almost, you know, disjoint points. And we have to sort of turn it into a manifold before we send it on to someone else. And I just want to make that point here, because I think that's a key issue that, if we're right about, it's not really reflected in this thing. It's another reason you need to do this, this sort of invariance step, if you will, or equivariance.
So I highlighted a part I thought it was really well written in this. I just like the way they word this, and that really goes with what you just said, or it really connects to it. So when they're talking about how this manifold flattening might occur, they're talking about ways it could happen. The third potentially key idea is that time implicitly supervises manifold flattening. The information density of those words is great. Time implicitly supervises manifold flattening.
Well, that's a theme we've had here for years.
And then a second one, like this is also well said and very dense. Temporal image evolution spells out the degrees of freedom of object manifolds. So yeah, I can give you a second, but it's
evolution.
So how that changes over time, it forms the principal components of the manifold that you're building.
As you're watching something, as things are changing in front of you, like cars are passing, the car's door is opening, all sorts of manipulations are happening. That car is sort of moving through a manifold, and let's see, by just watching how it evolves over time, its various degrees of freedom, you're just going to see them, and so time, yes, watching how an image changes over time spells out the various degrees of freedom. The car door opening, the car rotating,
So if you had a little thing that said these things are physically connected to each other in the image, and there's this evolution, you have an almost implicit supervisor saying, this is connected, this is the same thing, this is the same thing, this is the same thing. And then, but I'm getting all these different inputs. I'm not saying it's transforming to something different. I'm trying to basically, in a almost a self-supervised way, argue somehow this is the same thing, and how can I make it so? So I think that, that's what that connotates to me.
Yes. Yeah.
So the problem is, it just seems like they're mixing two things here. One is temporal image evolution. That could be just me looking at, the skull and turning around, talking about my dear friend. Or it could be the car door opening. And those are two very different things. One are different poses. One are actually degrees of freedom of the object's state in some sense, right? And do they recognize those differences? Because you talk about the car door opening, that's one type of temporal image evolution, not the other.
I don't think they specifically talked about that type of manipulation of an object. I threw that in there.
Okay, so that was your addition to it.
Yeah.
And of course the other thing that's, and I think you're probably going to get to this. We've got this idea that every column is in some sense can operate on its own, just like every finger can operate on its own. And I'm certain that's right. So no brain looks at the whole image. That just doesn't happen, right? Parts of the cortex look at pieces of the image, and they do their own temporal integration, and then they just pass it on. So that's another complication here. I just want to point that out, that so often people think about vision, they talk about images as if the image is the entire image. But it's never that. The brain never looks at the entire image. So I'm not sure, I can't read into this too much. When I see anyone says something about the image, it makes me wonder, are they recognizing that fact, or are they thinking about it as an entire image processing at any point? Or am I deep reading too much into that?
I think the principle, what they're saying there, they could apply equally to a cortical column that's just receiving input from a small part of the visual field. That they could apply that sentence to that. I could go on a research project taking that sentence and turning it into a cortical column, temporal.
Well, okay, so again, if I look at a column, most of the changes, temporal evolution, 99% of temporal evolution is because the column is moving, not because the underlying object is moving. And until you accept that or understand that, then a lot of your thinking about these things can get really screwed up.
Yeah, we talked about that in the context of the deep learning network, right? Which is also trying to learn the cards.
Yeah, I don't know enough about how they do that.
On top of the self-motion of the object.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say once you bring sensory motor into this, that's another way of another way of what's the word? That's another way of getting the degrees of freedom of the object manifold. Moving left is going to be one of my degrees of freedom, and your various movements that'll be one set of degrees of freedom as your own movements.
Can I put in like one more aspect to this discussion? I mean, don't need to like delve too deep on it because I'm also curious, about this. But just sort of an idea, because I'm very used to that from working memory. The idea, of course, being if you were to follow the sort of building invariant representations hierarchy, then you wouldn't just expect, neatly separable object classifiers high up the hierarchy, like in a feed-forward structure like this, right, what we get in deep neural networks. But you would also expect something that is temporally very stable. And that is, of course, not the case if you look up very high in the cortical hierarchy, like in prefrontal cortex, like activity is super dynamic. It's, not really much slower than it is in V1. But it's still the case that if you apply multivariate sort of classifiers on top of that data of multi-unit recordings, then you can separate out a stable subspace and a dynamical coding subspace. So there's a wonderful paper by Murray and 2014, I think, where they do just that. So you can find principal components, which is sort of this idea of the manifold, in which the temporal activity moves. That's not the equivariance idea of all the different representations of the object, but these three objects that I have to hold in mind, right? They have, to some extent, like a certain stable space, but they move within that in the manifold, highly dynamically. Yeah. So there's two different aspects. One is the equivariance of one object and all its representations, and the other one is that the representation itself is not stable, but moves temporally, dynamically inside a manifold.
Some of that made sense to me, but some of it didn't. But I don't want to focus on that. Right now.
I kind of want to dive deeper into that after I go through these points.
Okay.
So
thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video, please.
Let's do this person.
Okay. So motivations. What caused me to say, hey, it's worthwhile for me to present this was like, first I'll read this. Historically, we've kind of evaluated models on how does it achieve invariance. Concrete example, last week, Matt and Flo were, mostly Matt, a little bit of Flo, were presenting that the framework, the three visual streams one, and a lot of the conversation started centering around this, like how does it achieve invariance? So now I'm starting to gather that maybe part of what you have in mind when you say this is sort of like how this blue line becomes this blue line. Maybe that's kind of what you're going for.
And I'm also saying that, and we recognize this in our frameworks paper, a column tries to do as much of that as possible. Under certain conditions, a single column can do complete flattening for that, or enough flattening. But in other situations, it can't. So it's like everybody tries to do this as much as possible, and in many situations, a single hierarchy level in the cortical hierarchy is sufficient for doing everything you want to do, but on other situations, it's not. So it doesn't say that. It just says that everybody tries to do as much as is possible, and that's what it means. It's a many-to-one map. It's on a continuum.
Yeah.
So the interesting distinction between the word invariance and equivariance, I don't know if that's commonly used now, whether we should adopt that.
It's become more popular the past few years. Like Bruno's saying it now. I think Jeff Hinton made it big, and now people are doing it a lot.
Okay, because in my mind, there's sort of flavors. Invariance has always been a degreed item, not a. You have a goal, perhaps, of complete stability, but you never achieve that.
I see.
So,
I didn't even realize you thought of this as this is a form of invariance.
Well, I've always felt that the cortical column can only do so much of it, but everybody has to do a little bit. Every column has to be doing this many-to-one mapping as much as they can. And even this says that too. They're basically, you're locally flattening, it requires V1 to do some flattening, right? It just doesn't happen automatically.
Okay. For now, I'll agree with that. I want to think about it more. keep in mind that sometimes maybe small regions of this are going to be stretched out to be much larger up here. Sometimes tiny changes in the pixels are actually like really, really important for distinguishing semantic meaning. So sometimes little things are going to become longer here. So there's a lot of stretching and compressing.
Let's come back to that in a moment when we talk the stuff that Florian talking about. Also, I'm going to talk about this whole idea of attention and the role of attention through this process. But anyway, okay.
So. Now I'll bring up, maybe this is an obvious point of why this is relevant. I'll just read it. If cortical columns are really representing object identity, why hasn't anybody noticed? It seems like at least the cartoon version of object identity, if you just go for a basic one, the first time anyone ever did a multi-unit recording in V1 on monkeys, they would have realized like, whoa, that's representing objects or object identities. It seems like by broadcasting this message that we expect object identity to be represented all over the place, we're giving people an easy reason to just cast off the thousand brains theory, because they'll be like, we would know about that.
Do you remember we wrote in the paper why they wouldn't see that?
I've forgotten now, so I'm sorry.
I can tell you again if you want, or I can wait till you get to the next.
Okay, you can tell me now, because
the idea here is that whether it's, again, let's call it, instead of calling it object identity, calling it as much stability as you get, more stability than you have on the input, okay? And we speculated, first of all, it's going to be a very sparse coding in the upper layers, very sparse, because that's only way you can get any capacity here. It's got to be very sparse. And so you're going to, when you stick a probe in, and those individual neurons will be shared among different representations. And they will either be on a particular presentation, if you had an animal that was alive, or awake, and which you need to do, it has to be awake, which you didn't have awake now. So if you have an awake animal, and you're looking at these, and it's attending the stuff, and you look at these upper neurons, what you're going to either see, most of the neurons are going to be silent, or a few of them will be steadily active. But those steadily active ones cannot be uniquely always associated with a physical object, because on another object, they could also be active. But the point is, as you're going down through these upper layers, you're going to find very few active neurons, only a few, and those few seem to be stable over movements of the eye. And so they immediately, those have been observed. They just ignore them because they don't seem to be correlated with the changing input.
Oh. Because we're always looking for receptor fields.
They're trying to find something that responds with this particular changing input. So like, I'm moving this line back and forth. Well, these old neurons are silent. This one over here seems to be firing continuously, so it can't be very interesting. And so they immediately go down and look for the active cells that have this correlation. And so this has been observed that so many, over 50% of the cells are completely ignored because they either have those two things, either they're silent or they're continually firing, but it's very sparse. And that individual neuron can't label the object. It has to be looked at population code. So that was the reason that nobody noticed it. It's just they were having trouble finding cells that responded to anything. So when they find a cell that seems to be active constantly, it doesn't make a difference. So they weren't looking for it.
Even like now with neuropixels, where people just put it in and record massive numbers of neurons, either these people are about to find these in the next couple of years, and we just kind of got lucky and had the theory a couple of years
ago.
Well,
it is a strong prediction. The theory, yeah. Strong meaning unexpected, yeah. and testable. So again, there's a set of requirements to see this. You have, for example, I would have to have like a monkey or something looking at some image, and knowing that the monkey is not attending to different parts of the image, but just saccading over the image without attending to components. It's a little hard to do, and hard to know that's happening. Under those conditions, then you should see a sparse stable pattern, or sparse stable pattern in the upper layers and the lower layers, and maybe very sparse.
But this is actually opposite of what we do in experimental paradigms, where we make monkeys stare at dots, and we
actually literally try to get them to attend to different things as opposed to just look at something.
Right.
Because if you were attending to different things, every time you attend to different things, every time you move your eyes, if you're attending to a different thing, then literally, then the whole thing will change. Then your upper layer representations will change too. So it's the stability, you can perceive it yourself. One, do you have stable representations? It's not when you're attending the different components. It's when I'm not attending, I'm just like looking at you and my eyes are saccading over you. That's what, and that stability of my perception has to be somewhere in the stability of the neurons. That's just like a fact, I think. And so that's what you're looking for. And I'm arguing you would see some level of that even in V1. And of course, again, if I wanted to do it in V1, I'd have to make sure that the thing I'm attending over a small individual space. I wouldn't make a big thing because that's part of the thousand brain theory. The V1 column is going to do complete object identity or object invariance, small things, but not big things. So but you could set up that experiment. And I don't think, when we came up with this idea, I went back and I read the literature, some of the early literature, the Hubel and Wiesel stuff, to make sure that they didn't look for this. It was like, okay, because this is a strong prediction, they could easily falsify the theory. And I didn't spend a hell of a lot of time at it, but I did a quick perusal of a bunch of papers, and I couldn't find anything which suggested people were actually looking for the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't found any papers that just like obviously refute it. My suspicion is that a number of labs have gone and done some quick exploratory experiments just to sanity test, make sure there's no like object ID cells in V1. Then they go on and work on something that they're going to be able to get published. And so I feel like these kinds of things, maybe if you talked to the right people, they could tell you, oh no, I've actually tried that.
That's right.
So there's no paper.
So right. And so anyway, by publishing it, and we actually, I think we put it in the framework paper.
Yeah.
That this was a prediction, I explained why you would not have seen this, why these experiments would have easily, I might be confused because I know I put it in the book. So I think it's in the paper too. I think it's back in the framework paper, but I think it's in there too. Because that was a strong, again, like people tell you, like just like you said, well, why haven't we seen these?
Let's see. So going back to what you were saying earlier, then it sounds like you're a little bit flexible to the idea that object identity might not be a discrete thing. It might be more something like this blue line has become this blue line. That
I guess
that some kind of many-to-one mapping has occurred.
I think it's the many-to-one mapping is the key. And I would argue that every column or every high point in the hierarchy or every region of Cortex has to be doing a many-to-one mapping. That's part of what Cortex has to do. It's just like if I can even if sometimes I can put a label on something, then I have to do a many-to-one mapping. And I have to do it multiple times, or at least one step. But I did, starting about, maybe, guess it would be now, it would be 10 years ago or something. After we did the sequence memory, we realized that the sequence memory did not require an object identity to work at all. Just didn't require it. It's like, wow, look at this. The key insight there was that every single point in the sequence has a unique ID, a unique representation. I was like, wow, I never thought of that. That's amazing. So now everything is classifiable, therefore, and the whole thing can work without any object ID or any stabilization. On the other hand, I felt like, well, but I can sometimes name a song. So if I can name a song, I don't think am I going to label every single note of the song? And that's why I made this argument multiple times that it's easiest for us to name a melody if we hear the refrain or the chorus, because that part is repeated over and over again. And if I'm trying to remember the name of a song, often I can't remember it. I know this song. I can't think of the name of it. And then I get to the chorus. Oh yeah, that's it, of course. So that tells us that and we also know that temporal pooling is a very memory intensive process. So you can't label everything. So it labels as much as it can.
So you keep talking about temporal pooling as basically it needs to recognize this pattern, and it needs to recognize this pattern and this pattern and this pattern.
All I'm saying, temporal pooling is a many-to-one mapping. That's it.
Got it. Okay.
Right. And so I'm not even saying it's on a manifold. It's like these almost like these random points in space. Whether you want to call it a manifold, I don't care, but it's not a continuous manifold.
I guess what comes to mind is that when you talk about these big capacity limits, if you can reframe temporal pooling as I was going to say,
Here, can I?
You're doing this problem of having to learn a bunch of patterns and move them into a smaller thing, and it's better if you can somehow set it up as more of like, you know, a linear mapping where everything on one side of this line, if you can, this blue dotted dashed line, I should use a different color, does not take large capacity to represent. If you have some neural mechanism for figuring out whether the
but to get to these curves so that you can do that, it does take a lot.
Okay.
I mean, I think of it from a different perspective, right? Okay. I think of it from this many to one mapping. It's just I got a bunch of points and I have to have fewer points, and so the way I think about it is like, oh, now I realize that these points, if I were just to look at them, if I were to look at all the points of the location points that represent the points on a coffee cup or the points that represent the notes in a melody, if I look at them in space, I can't see that they're next to each other or either, like they're just, remember, we're in binary dimensions here, right? So it's really weird to think about manifolds and that 10,000 binary dimensions. Mm-hmm. The whole idea of these smooth manifolds doesn't really make any sense anymore because everything's going one bit away. But so I have all these points in this space, and if I looked at them, I could not tell you by looking at these points that any of them are related to any others. And if I had a different object in this space, here's my different object, they would be equally dispersed. You couldn't, there's nothing by looking at the points themselves, the points being which neurons are active in the green dot and which neurons are active in the black dot. There's nothing that tells you they're adjacent, they're on a manifold. But what you're trying to do then is, the outcome of this, let's say I have 1,000 dots here, or maybe let's say 100 dots here, right? I'm going to try to come up with, the output of this is I'm going to have fewer dots. Never it's going to be on a continuous manifold. I've never seen that anywhere. It's just fewer dots. And so some number of these dots are going to map to this, and some number of these dots are going to map to that. And maybe this dot doesn't map. Maybe it gets represented one-to-one because I couldn't do any kind of pooling on it. But the point is, in the end, I have fewer dots here, and there is a many-to-one mapping from a set of these dots to each of these. And if I was really lucky, these dots are not neurons; these dots are SDRs, right? If I was really lucky, I might be able to say, hey, this is a simple object, or this is a simple melody. I can remember the whole thing, and I only have one dot. And that's it. It's all, and then I can have a green dot. So that would be lucky. But the point is, the process just tries to get to as few as possible, and then the next region will have the same kind of input and will do the same thing. How that relates exactly to this, classifier and these sort of manifold pictures, I don't really know. I have trouble imagining the idea of continuous manifolds in binary spaces. Just doesn't work in my head. It's like I can't. Everything's like bundled up in a big knot of points that are right next to each other. If you know what I mean by that.
Yeah. I'll have to think more about many-to-one mappings in general. I don't have much good to say on that right now.
It just seems that that's an inherently absolute requirement in brains to do many-to-one mappings. If I'm ever going to classify something.
So rather than think of it as a manifold, can you think of it as a graph cut that you can basically, draw a virtual thing where you cut all the links in that would have led to that many-to-one mapping.
I don't know if those words mean.
Okay, so in graph theory, there's basically in a neural network you have a graph.
Are you talking about the connectivity between the neurons?
Yeah. So.
But we're not talking about connectivity. We're talking about activations, right?
Right, but for an instant, I'm saying connectivity in an abstract sense. When you think of the activation lining up certain numbers of axons heading into a connected network.
Okay, yeah, I could say if I have 200 active neurons, I can imagine connecting them, right, into some sort of graph. But there isn't anything really there. I can imagine that.
Well, I think one of the problems is that when you're drawing these interstitial neurons firing up and saying there's nothing to separate them, well, there's not physically, but their activations in themselves, in of themselves, create a virtual network that goes to into some one or set of smaller number of neurons. So I think part of the problem when you think of the manifold, because of the discreteness, is that the manifold kind of comes out of linear constraint theory, where you can just cut space, in some kind of hyperspace. But if you think of it in terms of a graph, these things are separable. They're not physically, you can't disentangle them, but you can light them on up and aggregate them into one or another bundle.
Yes. But isn't that just the same? Is that just the same as an SDR? I can say, oh, these cells come active together to mean something.
Right, but you can. Part of the thing is that we're trying to imagine this and looking at them and saying it's a manifold, that there is some linear separable thing between these things, these activations. I'm saying these are just, you basically lit up networks that overlap in space, but they're unique in how they actually, when they light up. And then you can treat it as a graph, and you can use all of the power of graph theory to describe what's going on.
I don't know, but how would I use graph theory to classify them?
There's notions of cliques, of coloring, of how connected the things are in node, out node. There's lots of ways of describing connectivity using graph theory.
Yeah. So maybe, but again, I don't know, maybe that's helpful. We haven't thought about it that way here, and I don't know if it's fruitful or not. So you're welcome to pursue that and educate us. Again, when I think about these points, these SDRs, I think of them as literally almost like random. The way we did the sequence memory, they were to a large extent random. And chosen. They were chosen out of columns, but beyond that, they were random. And therefore, there seems to be nothing you could do to look at those, the patterns, the different SDRs, to know. There's nothing you can do to look at them other than temporal proximity. That's the only thing you can really use, I think, to classify them. And so I don't think you could do any kind of statistical analysis or graph theory analysis of those points and discover anything. Right? It seems to be there's nothing there. It's just a bunch of random points we have to connect. We have to say these such points mean this one thing and these such points mean something else. And anyway, so I'm not sure that graph theory would work. But maybe you're right. I don't know enough about it.
In some way, I think it's a bridge between pure neural network theory and what they're doing with computational neural networks. I think there's a way of describing it as a bridge between those two things, because people are working on processors now that are basically they're not convolutional neural networks, but they're graph networks.
So that might work, but here's my caution about that. I hope 40 years of me working on this says that when you just start saying, okay, we don't need to worry about how the neurons are doing this. Let's think about it from some mathematical perspective. You end up in a dead end. And so I think you have to think about the neurons. You have to visualize them. You have to be understanding what they are telling us. And if you start saying, oh, and maybe I can solve this problem using this particular part of mathematical theory, dozens of people have done this under different ways, and they all get stuck. So I don't think you can maybe learn something from it, but I don't think it's
unless you have a clear demonstration of this mathematical thing gets done by a certain circuit that we've seen, right? Then you can argue that.
That's the history of why computer vision had failed, because computer vision forever was not neurally based. It was all these ideas about stuff.
Yeah. What about the temporal aspect of all of this? So the fact that these representations, these SDRs, are not like stable in time, right? You think of them as sort of, these representations map to maybe to one to these representations, but in both of those places, right, activity is continually evolving even while a certain task constraint or
Is that true? I don't know about that. That's an interesting question. Are you saying like even if I'm fixated at some point, the neural populations are changing?
If you look at like high order, task relevant representations, yes, they are. You can tell time, right, all over the brain. And so there's a continual evolution of these representations, and they're not entirely free. So that's what I meant by.
I guess I'm trying to say, you say even under situations where I expect it to be stable,
Yes,
they change.
where the sensory input is entirely stable, right? There's still, activation is still continuously changing.
I guess I don't know enough about that.
Actually, continuously might be wrong because, of course, like.
Is it really? I mean, that sounds surprising to me. That I would have a stable input and then somehow above it, things are moving around all over the place.
I mean, there's going to be parts of the network that are going to be very nicely stable because they respond to, very clear, strong receptor fields and whatnot. And since their input is stable, they're going to be stable.
Yeah.
But what I'm talking about is not the lower sensory areas where you would see a lot of that stability when you fix the sensory input. What I'm talking about is the higher order areas, like prefrontal cortex and a working memory task, where the activity is not stable.
Yeah.
You would find with a multivariate decoder that you could stably decode the item that is in there for some time, but that doesn't mean that the activity is steady, that the same neurons keep firing and never stop.
Yeah.
That is a misunderstanding. That's what I viewed the working memory literature.
That's an interesting observation, and this goes back to the thing I wanted to talk about, retention, because I think they're kind of related. Let's talk about what we would see. You're looking at some prefrontal cortex, and you made the observation earlier that if we just observe that, it looks like it's changing all the time, right? Almost at the same rate as maybe your saccades are changing, something like that. Maybe a little bit slower, but
maybe it's an alpha rhythmic thing.
Yeah. So the way the Thousand Brain Theory says what's going on here is there's two ways you could be looking at something. One is like I was saying earlier, I'm looking at Marcus or a board, and I'm not attending to the individual components. My eyes are just looking around, and at that point, I'm arguing you're going to have stability. But most of the time, what we do when we go about the world, where we're constantly moving from, we're constantly attending to object after object after object after object. We can do this because of the voting in the columns. That you within a particular fixation, you can recognize the entire thing.
You can resolve
it, right? So there's not a lot to be gained from looking at different, once I've learned something, like, oh, I know that on air sign. There's no point in me looking at the letters again. I just recognize it, and so I would just staccato over that, I'd have stability. But that's not the way we normally go about the world. The normally go about the world is I would attend to object, attend to object, attend to object. And the whole idea of this is as you do this, every single new thing you attend to is going to create a complete new picture in the entire cortical column, all the way up to prefrontal cortex. And what we're trying to do is, but the whole point of this is to every moment to moment calculate the relative positions of these objects in the world relative to me and relative to other things. So you're constantly saying, where is this, where's that, where's this, where's that, where's this? And I'm building up these, Marcus knows what I'm talking about him, because we talked about these both permanent and temporary models of the world. That's what we really do most of the time. There's not much point in me just looking at the same car over and over again. I already learned that car. So the brain wants to basically attend to new things that I have not already learned as a group. So I can build this temporary positioning of what's going on in me right now. So under that situation, I would see changes in prefrontal cortex almost as rapid as the changes in V1. And that would be the normal situation.
Right.
I'd have to then say, now here's a picture, a famous photograph, and I want you to scan over it and look at it, but don't attend to any particular component of it, right?
I mean, like,
then I see stability in prefrontal cortex.
Right. We do see very stable firing in delayed master sample task working memory under a bunch of very particular conditions, right? Like one item, head fixed with a pointer, a directed attention, so no contravening task, right? Yeah. So I agree with that, right? There's lots of other things that make it complicated. But the fascinating thing is that even despite all that complication, when you run like this thing I mentioned that Murray and Wang did to look for the memory code, when I've shown you two objects, hide them, and your task is to, for some reason, because of the task, you need to remember them. The interesting thing is I can read out that object identity, even though there is no stable firing of this configuration of 6 neurons that keep firing.
So I didn't follow that again. So what, they're recording from where?
So you're recording prefrontal cortex activity. So
and what is this a person, an animal?
I think
Are these probes, or
I think it's a macaque.
Okay.
You know, multi-site recordings.
It's not fMRI. Okay, so then we got the probes in the brain, and what is the monkey doing now?
And you are trying to hold on to multiple objects.
Mentally.
Right, mentally, right?
Yeah.
So there's no way to have guided, uninterrupted attention and focus on one thing and not deviate from it, and that is the cause for your permanence. But the cause for the permanence should instead be that it's task relevant.
Yeah.
Right? And then what you see is you can indeed decode, right, as long as there's not too much distraction, right, some kind of a signal that detects that these items were put into the network, right? But that decoder is not very trivial. It's not a similar, very, you know, it's not a stable population.
Let's go. I'm not following completely, but I think there's other stuff going on, right? Mm-hmm. So imagine, you see me all the time. I close my eyes off in these meetings, right? That's because I'm trying to think about something, and I don't want the distraction from the visual input. That's right. I'm not consciously thinking that, but that's what I'm doing. Right. And so, you know, even the monkey sitting there doing some task, if they got some, some sort of temporary memory that they're trying to keep in their head, there's going to be processing going on in prefrontal cortex. It's actually nothing to do with the sensory input at that point in time. Right. And so, I don't know what that processing is. Maybe the monkey's going through multiple things. Maybe the monkey's thinking about the cute monkey he saw a moment ago. I don't know what the monkey's thinking about. Right. But the monkey's thinking about a bunch of stuff.
You're saying you can't control for these internal processes.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on up there that, you know, that's like you and I. We're always thinking about everything, you know, coming out of your head all the time. So it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on in prefrontal cortex. And most of the time, I think prefrontal cortex is going to be thinking on its own stuff, like, what am I going to do today? Blah, 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 blah. And, you know, what am I supposed to be remembering? And am I hungry? And then the other parts of the cortex may be recognizing things. I've always been impressed that at times, you can sort of catch yourself doing this, that you have this perception that you're always perceiving things. But in reality, often when you're thinking about something, you do all these things in your life without ever being conscious you did them. Like I'll pick up, you know, something off the counter, I'm doing this, I'm grabbing over here, pulling a drawer. If I ask myself about, oh yeah, I just did that. But most of the time you're not even aware you're doing these things because I'm thinking about something else. So the parts of the cortex seem to be doing multiple things, you know, lower level of taking care of all these motor functions and the visual system, you know, opening the drawer and pulling out the column, whatever it is. Right. But I'm thinking about, you know, oh, what do I have to do today, or what's the weather going to be like, or something like that. So it's really hard to control for this. That's all I'm just pointing at. It's just, I think these ideas that, you know, the cortex builds this invariant representation and it's done is like nonsense. That's not it at all.
I mean, the only reason why I brought this up was obviously in the context of invariance and equivariance, and I think that's super interesting with respect to what is the representation of an object. Yeah. And yeah, it's fair to say it's, you know, not one thing, right? It's very likely that it's many things, and you know, somehow the brain makes use of these equivariant representations. Yeah, sure. But I also wanted to point out that even those particular points on that manifold, right? Even those are not really ever static, right? So
I guess I'm a little questioning that a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting to say if under all the right controls, you know, for example, let's say I'm listening to a melody, and and that's all. It's a pure melody. There's no changing in instrumentation or anything like that. I'm listening to the same melody again, same key. Would the representations from note to note be different at different times? Our theory says no. Our theory says that they'd be the same representations. You know, at the same 14th note in this melody, you're going to have the same SDR. If they were different, that would be an interesting observation. It's kind of related to what you're saying. It's like saying, well, they're not always the same. Things might change and under a controlled situation. If that were really true, it would be interesting to know. It would be a little disappointing, but it'd be interesting to know.
It's these two different kinds of noise, right, that theoretical neuroscientists talk about. the sort of the noise that has meaning and the noise that has no meaning, right?
Yeah.
So is the noise that we observe just because of our inability to properly control for things, and because we can't jump back in time, so we can't ever repeat a trial except for in computational neuroscience we can, right? Because supercomputers can be set to the same thing, right? But in biology we never can. And so the question is all the noise really just because we can't control for things? Right? We can't reset the neurons, or is it actually that that the variability that we get trial to trial actually means something? That there's something else in there in terms of information.
I just remembered one other thing. Sorry.
At some point, I want to jump to my last bullet
Okay,
point.
you remember?
Yeah.
It was. I think it was a co-sign meeting, but I always refer to this, and you always tell me her name. Someone gave this talk. It was a keynote, one of the invited talks for the whole session, and she was talking about the other neurons in V1. Remember this?
Yes, this is the one you're referring to. You and Subutai saw it. Me and Yue missed it.
Okay, it was fascinating. She says, Hubel and Wiesel, they did these experiments and hundreds of people replicated them, but they only look at 40% of the neurons because those are the only ones that seem to respond. All the other ones that don't seem to respond correctly, they just ignore them because they're rarely on. For the reasons I said earlier, they're either quiet or they spike once and they stop or they stay active for a while.
Look at that,
right? So she said, let's do some analysis on them. And I don't remember how she did her analysis, but she said, we're going to record from all those other neurons that don't seem to be correlating at all to these inputs. And she showed that statistically they are correlated, I believe, to the object that was being presented to the animal. With no explanation how,
right?
But saying, but they are not noise. They are, there's something in there. There's a real signal in there that we can say what this thing represents over here to some extent. That just gets back to
which would be really a strong argument.
That was
thousand brains theory, and that's probably where that idea.
Yeah. So I forgot that one. I mentioned it earlier when you said when you said, when people notice this, and I said, yeah, well, if you look correctly, you do notice it.
Right.
Okay, your last point.
Sure. Yeah, last point. So here I've been arguing against representing object identity in every cortical column for various reasons. I said that hey, there's this other way these kinds of things can occur where object identity is only used in a couple of areas like language centers. So I'm making these various cases it's a little uncomfortable that there's not evidence for it. Maybe there's still room for it. The final point I was making was that computationally, it's sort of a weak thing to vote on. We use the one way we actually do use the object identity in our models is it's the thing all the cortical columns can agree on. They can help each other by voting on it. Now I've made this case for multiple years. I'll bring up a figure I made in 2017. So here I showed that when you're voting on object identity, here I'm showing two little toy objects where they have 5 features. This one is feature A, feature A, feature A. This one is a familiar object, feature A, feature B, feature C. If I take 5 sensors, like a hand, put it down on this object, and all they're doing is voting on object identity, this hand will still think it might be sensing this object because it's not doing any sort of, all it's doing is voting on object identity. It has no location information yet. And if instead they were voting on something equivariant, like an object at a certain pose, an object at a certain location relative to the sensor, that's much more powerful. This you touch it, senses immediately, sort of like what you think when you grab things with your hands, you sense immediately.
I agree with you. I think this is a good observation. And the other thing that to go along with it is that when I perceive stability in the world, like I see you as stable right now, it's at a pose. I don't just see some nebulous cloud labeled Marcus Lewis. I see Marcus Lewis standing in a certain way, in a certain position. This stability is the entire representation of you in its pose and so on. And I think that's evidence that the voting thing, which I believe is the stability thing, is that. It's a different argument you're making here, but it's
This is the same argument.
I have trouble with this presentation.
Okay.
I struggle with it a bit. And so the problem, I just haven't got my head around it completely. The problem I see with that, it seems like there's too many things to vote on. I don't understand this. I just don't get it yet. It's like, if one did say, okay, we're all voting on whether this is Marcus, well, that's pretty easy. You're one thing. But if I have to vote on all you and all the possible poses, well, that's an unlimited number of things. You could be in any number of poses, and they're not learned because I can see you in a new pose. So I just don't know how to do that.
Maybe we can take a cue from our imagination, right? I mean, like if we're thinking of, let's say, an apple, right? Think of an apple, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you have some mental image, and that apple has a pose.
Yeah.
For example, I'm predicting that that apple has a stem that is looking up.
Well, because
how did I know that?
Because it's funny, because normally I would do that, but since you have to do this exercise, I was imagining every single possible I can imagine. So,
right, exactly.
But normally I would, right? Normally I would.
Right. So maybe, right, there's a preference for specific poses that stand in sort of, as that they're not a name because they're still an object and a pose, but we somehow prefer them.
But okay, so we do. But let's say now, so that would argue that maybe that I could recognize the object and everyone could vote on it if it was in its preferred pose. But let's say it's just not in its preferred pose. What happens then? Do maybe I don't recognize it all at once. Maybe you're saying I can't vote on it and just get it right away. If I see the apple sideways, I may have to attend.
Maybe you don't recognize Marcus immediately if he's upside down.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's certainly a lot of truth to that, right?
So keep in mind when I'm saying pose, I am referring to both location and orientation. Right. And in some ways, like this picture, and when I talk about a marker or whatever, both are important. But the point is that that it's like I'm sensing a marker, and the marker is right here. That second piece of information is the important part. Yes, you might have a canonical orientation. That's probably a part of this. But the canonical orientation only solves part of it. Canonical.
I've argued that the distance. I'm not sure you were talking about touch, but I was thinking about vision, like you said.
Vision is better.
But I've argued that the distance in vision could be solved a different way. That it might be related to that scaling factor I'm talking about with the dominance. Because when I think about seeing you, and I'll say, oh, how was Marcus standing? Oh, I remember how you were standing. You had your hands behind your back, you had your feet close together, right? But if I were to ask, how far away were you? Now, of course, I'm thinking about it now, but I'm not sure I would know that. It's weird when I look at text of different sizes, or I look at pictures of different sizes. I'm not even conscious how size of it is. I just it's like I'm there. It's like yeah, the pose is correct, but the distance to me doesn't seem to be important. It's just like it disappears somehow, unless I tend to that. And so maybe we could stick to just the pose part, but even that still is a very, very difficult thing to vote on because there's too many poses. So how could that work?
Well, there's a concrete answer. There's there's the way that displacement cells originally came about was me solving that problem. But I mean, we can also point out the problem. We can. I would bring it up. So that was how.
Sorry.
Let's see. Will this be perfect? Oops.
I don't Kevin and Michelangelo even Floyd know what this was.
Oh yeah.
I'm aware.
Yeah, it was in the paper, but there was so many discussions on it. It's so damn hard to understand.
So this was before we called them displacement cells. These were the original displacement cells. Think of the sensor relative to specific object. This is our columns plus model. This layer is something I coded a couple years ago. So this is the location. This is the location of the sensor. This is multiple grid cell modules. I had some fun with the visualization. You can see the firing fields.
I've not seen this one. That's a really cool.
So the way I had it happen, was what they vote on. Yes, I included this object layer. It wasn't necessary, but I included it just so that I could connect it to the rest of our model. What these really vote on is this mystery population of grid cell modules, which sometimes.
Is that your mystery population? Is that the striatum?
A claustrum. Now, I called it the claustrum because the claustrum projects to layer 6 of multiple areas, but I was just making stuff up. Who knows? The point is, part of me thought that I was eventually going to take this and insert it here and get rid of the object ID. But for now, I was putting it somewhere else just so I could present the idea to everyone. And So the way I had it happen was they voted on the location of the object in another reference frame, the body's reference frame. Or the way I phrased it here, it's the location of the body relative to a specific object, similar to how grid cells track the location of your body relative to the environment.
Is that doing with the pose issue or just doing with the distance from the issue?
It's your location relative to it. So it's the distance, and when you're talking about distance, you're taking you're converting to saying like, okay, this is this far away. Yeah. And then you have this XY component that you still need to represent.
But that's not the pose. The pose is like, is it this,
It's all 6 dimensions. Pose usually is top.
Pose is everything.
Yes.
In computer vision, usually pose refers to location and orientation. That's how Jeff Hinton uses it, for example. And so, yes, we might divide these up differently and solve them in different ways. Where I'm going with this was a general solution to a lot of this problem. So you're right that orientation is where this starts to become difficult, and there's more things to solve.
Okay, so that's key thing for me, right?
Orientation might be what Florian just said. It might be canonical. You have an object and you guess just like, okay, I'm just going to guess it's upright.
So you're guessing an archetype. That is perfect image of the thing in your mind.
Maybe, yeah.
But I mean,
or a couple of perfect images. You might try a couple of
yeah, I'm thinking if I'm presented a flash image of you as you are right now, and a flash image of you still with different clothing on upside down, I'm probably not going to recognize you. And I'm thinking, okay, if he's sitting there suspended upside down, what am I going to do? I'm going to head down, look at the face, and then it's still going to look a little weird. I'm going to spend a lot of processing time trying to do the identity. So something else is going on.
So yeah, if I go through the whole attending to the components part, so if I see something I say I don't recognize, I attend to the components, then we're out of this problem. We're back to composing an object out of subcomponents, and it's a slightly different problem. So it's really the question is recognizing the apple at its side or upside down. But something like a coffee cup can have lots of normal presentations to me that aren't canonical at all, and I don't have to do this attentional mechanism to recognize the coffee cup. Anyway, I think this is going to get into bigger topics, longer, I guess, than we want to discuss it. I think, let me just remind us of two things. There seems to be two populations of neurons in the cortex that could solve the voting, can just do voting. These layer 2-3 cells can vote, and these the small layer 5 cells, not the intrinsic person ones, the other ones. Those are two classically known long projection within a region, across regions, and so on.
Yeah, so nicely recurrent also.
Yeah, so we have these two voting populations. We don't know why we have two. I think you're right that we have described it incorrectly, that we've said, oh, we're voting on object identity, but we're really voting on object pose and identity. I don't know which of those two we're doing that with.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to do the pose. It seems problematic. It seems like, maybe you've got the solution here somehow with this, I mean, I think the idea of this, the displacement cells and the claustrum idea, those are really big clues. I think those are big clues. But we never got all that working. We just didn't get all of it working. So there's a bunch of mystery there. And I think we can leave it at that today. I am hopeful, I'm just expressing my wishes, that by driving into this problem from a mini column perspective, which is still going back to this idea of a 1D sort of grid cell type of thing, that somehow that's going to unravel all these problems. That is the solution will start becoming clearer. Because I think when we've talked about displacement cells and we've talked about all these things, we've always done it at a sort of a column level, but we haven't, even grid cells, we've done it at a column level. We haven't really incorporated this key component of mini columns. And I think somehow that I'm just hoping that it's going to unravel it for us. And we'll be able to come back to all these things and have a clear picture of how it works. That's
Yes, an intellectually healthy thing to stay uncomfortable, with one's own sort of early conceptualizations, right? There's still things to be worked out.
Oh, yeah.
So keep an open mind when you see things, how they might fit into a puzzle.
Yes, and I know we didn't solve all these problems. We just know it, we didn't close. Well, we're close. We made big progress. We shouldn't have done anything. I think this discussion was great. I think you did a really nice job on this, Marcus, today, just going through these issues. I hope I didn't come across defensive about it, but I don't think they're really that far off from but the way we can think about it. And I can see why I might have thought otherwise. So I often use the idea that, hey, I can say the name for this object, therefore there must be the stable.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. But it doesn't mean that's the goal of the whole system, and they all have to work that way.
Okay.
But at some point, if I am able to label the object, there's some point I have to have a representation that's unique and stable.
Yeah.
So
it doesn't necessarily need to be all over the place. That's essentially the point of this.
Yeah. And I think this idea of flattening the manifolds, well, again, I don't think it's really a manifold, but
I'd like to address that point sometime, not right now,
Okay.
but the idea that the binary thing is compatible with manifolds, but not right now.
I mean, maybe it's just manifolds are always pictured as these nice little sheets.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true here, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, so that was a very useful exercise, I think. So, just thanks for doing it.
All right, I think we are ready to end it.
Yeah.